Mark Chavez was an Ivy Leaguer who majored in philosophy at Dartmouth before going on to graduate studies in both sociology and divinity at Harvard. He finished his sociology PhD from Harvard in 1991. He started teaching at Loyola in Chicago shortly after Roger Fink had passed through there, and then taught at Notre Dame long enough to get promotion and tenure. In 1998, he moved to the University of Arizona for 9 years before shifting again to his current position at Duke University in both the Department of Sociology and the Duke Divinity School. Most of his research on religion has looked at social dynamics within congregations. Philip Gorski earned a 1986 Social Studies BA at Harvard. He switched to the West Coast for his 1996 PhD in sociology from Berkeley, while Chavez was teaching at Notre Dame. Gorski's academic career started at Wisconsin-Madison, where he was tenured in 2001, in the same year this article was published. In 2004, he returned to New England and took posts at Yale University in both sociology and religious studies. He has written mainly in the field of social theory, with a lot of attention to Max Weber's work and to historical study of European society. Shortly after Chavez moved to Arizona, he and Gorski were invited to prepare this 2001 review of what had been going on in the debate over the religious marketplace literature during the decade of the 1990s. Whenever a particular debate goes on for a while in social research, eventually the editors of the prestigious Annual Review of Sociology decide that it is time for a definitive review of the various arguments. They find a couple of the leading scholars on the subject and ask them to write a review article weighing the evidence on both sides so that readers can judge for themselves which side seems to be winning. After more than a decade of articles debating whether competition between religious groups is good for the vitality of religion, Chavez and Gorski were asked to write this article for the 2001 edition of the Annual Review. They first of all remind us that there was already a dominant theory linking religious pluralism to religious participation. People had pretty much settled on the conclusion presented by Peter Berger in his influential 1969 book, The Sacred Canopy, a standard textbook in the sociology of religion. Berger expected that having many different religious groups competing side by side in a society would tend to turn people off from religion and lower the overall level of religious involvement in the population. For Berger, this was a question of plausibility. With only one religious framework in your society, all doctrines and practices can become natural, and nobody will doubt or question it. In medieval Europe, if the Pope excommunicated a king or a prince in some little kingdom somewhere, everybody everywhere knew for sure that this king or prince was going to burn in hell for all eternity. But if one group says the Pope speaks for God, and another group says, no, he doesn't, what are we to think? If one group says that Jesus was both human and divine, and another group says, no, he was just a human like you or me, and a third group says, no, he was pure divine spirit and not human at all, what are we to think? If one group says you have to belong to their group or go to hell, and all the other groups say the same thing, what are we to think? Multiple religious groups bring the danger, according to Berger, of relativizing all beliefs, creating doubt, and so weakening both religious faith and religious participation. This negative plausibility effect dominated sociological thinking about the coexistence of multiple religions when sociologists Roger Fink and Rodney Stark got religion with respect to free market economic theory in the 1980s. For them, as we have seen, the religious icon of unregulated competition in a marketplace took center stage for studying religion as well as for any other institutionalized feature of society. Many contending religious groups were a sign of a healthy, functioning free market, not a source of doubt about the soundness of any one version of religion. Competition was supposed to improve the quality of the religious product being delivered to consumers, not relativize and weaken it. Competition was supposed to stimulate our interest in the religious product and fill more churches with more people consuming the new and improved range of religion on the market. Once this idea got loose in the sociological literature, the contest was joined. The debate raged in one published article after another for a dozen years before the annual review editors decided to add up the score. Chavez and Gorski became our scorekeepers. To add up that score, first they had to sort out the rules for deciding how religious pluralism or vitality affected religious involvement or participation. The most important rules had to be a clear definition of what we mean by religious pluralism on the one hand, and what we mean by religious involvement or participation on the other. Right from the start, Chavez and Gorski throw out a lot of research articles that they decided were not really looking at a connection between these two topics of religious pluralism and religious participation. First of all, they made it clear that to measure religious pluralism, you can't just count how many different church buildings or congregations you find. If you count the number of church buildings shown on a map of London, this doesn't measure religious diversity, because nearly all of them are part of the same Church of England. All these local congregations from the same religious denomination don't count as religious diversity. Usually these congregations are not actually competing because church leaders planned out the different congregations to cover different areas or territories, like franchises of the same fast food chain. Similarly, you can't just study one entire religious group like all the Southern Baptists or all the Mormons or all the Roman Catholics and ask how many of the people in Georgia or Utah or Maryland belong to one of these groups. As Chavez and Gorski point out, your group might be 10% of the population in two different places, but in one of those places there might be 9 other groups, each with another 10% of the people, while in the other place all of the other 90% are in one other group. Your group has 10% in both places, but clearly the religious diversity and pluralism is not the same in both places. We have to come up with some measure that takes into account how all religious people are distributed into different religious groups. Most research on the subject has settled on a well-known standard measure that we will just call the Pluralism Index, even though it goes by many other names when it is used in the same way to measure other kinds of outcomes. First, you find the proportion that each group contributes to the total population of religious believers. These proportions always add up to 100% of all the believers. Then you square each of these proportions, add them all together, and subtract the total from 1. Consider one of only 2 groups to see the properties of this index. When our group includes everybody, our proportion is 1.0. Squared is still 1.0. The other group has no members, and 0 squared is still 0. 1 plus 0 gives 1, and subtracting 1 from 1 gives 0. There is no pluralism. Everybody's in our group. The same thing happens if everybody's in the other group. 0 plus 1 is the same as 1 plus 0, and there's still no pluralism. The maximum pluralism score comes when we have half the believers and the other group has half the believers, which seems logical. 1/2 squared gives 1/4 for us, and again for the other group. Added together gives 1/2 again, subtracted from 1 to give a pluralism index of 0.5. Pluralism is greatest for 2 groups when they split the religious believers evenly between them. More generally, this pluralism score increases when there are more groups, just as we would expect it to do. If all the groups are the same size, the score is 1.0 minus 1 over the number of groups. Even if the groups are not all the same size, the index still mainly reflects the number of groups sharing the total number of believers. For example, if groups vary in size according to the standard rank size rule, the index shows slightly less pluralism or diversity. This rule predicts that the second largest group is half the size of the largest group, the third largest group is 1/3 the size of the largest group, and so on. Highest pluralism scores come when the different groups get more and more equal to each other in size. This pluralism index actually was agreed on by scholars fairly early in the debate as a standard way to measure religious diversity, so that everybody would know what everybody else was talking about. The key thing to remember about this pluralism index is that everything about it refers only to the religious people in the population. It is all about how those religious people are distributed across different religious denominations or groups. It does not ask at all about the other people in the population who don't have anything to do with any religious group. That question is reserved for the other piece of the puzzle, the question of religious participation or involvement, which we will take up next. Once Chavez and Gorski settled on a definition for how to measure religious pluralism or diversity within the population of active believers, they could look around and find all of the research articles that measured such pluralism using a pluralism index. Everybody knew how the scores on this index were calculated and exactly what they meant about diversity among religious believers. Higher scores meant more groups of more equal sizes. Lower scores meant fewer groups of more unequal sizes. Once they found a bunch of articles using this kind of measure, they could then sort through them to see whether these studies also looked at religious involvement, at the vitality of religion for the whole population of a society in general. Just as they had decided for their pluralism measure, they also decided that for study of religious vitality in the larger society, you can't just look at one religious group. More Baptists in the population of Atlanta does not necessarily mean that Atlanta is more religious, because there could be fewer people in any other religious group, and Atlanta as a whole might actually end up less involved in religion. For pretty much the same reason, they decided to ignore some interesting research that counted up the number of people switching from one denomination or sect to another. Starting from any particular distribution of religious believers across a set of different groups, somebody might argue that if you double the number of people who are switching around from one of these groups to another, this obviously measures some kind of competition between the groups. So it might have been another way to measure pluralism or competition, but this does not measure the extent or vitality of religion overall within the larger total population. If they're simply moving from one group to another, there's no effect on the total share of the population that gets involved with religion in the first place. Studies of proselytizing or attracting believers out of one group and into another do not contribute anything to the debate that Chavez and Gorski have to evaluate. What we need is some kind of indicator of the extent of religious activity or involvement in the total population. For example, we could conduct a survey and ask people how important religion is to them in their personal lives. If more people said that religion was more important in their lives, we could count this as greater religious vitality or involvement. Chavez and Gorski do not look at this kind of measurement, though. They decide that such measures of subjective beliefs may measure a kind of spirituality, but this is not quite the same thing as involvement in religion as an organized social institution. The free market competition argument usually refers to people's behavior rather than their subjective attitudes. They focus on research articles that measure religious vitality or involvement by looking at church attendance. What share of the total population actually attend church services? How often do they go to church? When more people go to church more often, no matter what denomination is involved, we count this as higher involvement or more religious vitality. When fewer people go to church at all, and when they attend less often, we count this as lower involvement or less religious vitality in the population as a whole. To compare religious pluralism measured by the Pluralism Index to religious vitality measured by church attendance, researchers pretty much have to collect information about a lot of people. This is what Chavez and Gorski call large N studies, where N refers to the number of people or the size of the population covered by a particular study. These are not questions that can be measured and settled by looking at a small group of neighbors or by doing participant observation in one or two first-person settings. You need statistics to settle this debate. Some of the arguments during the 1990s focused on what scale was the most appropriate for such large N studies. The basic idea is that if we draw a boundary around some particular area, then the measure of pluralism, the number and relative sizes of different groups within that area, could represent actual competition between the groups. And the measure of total church attendance within that area could represent the importance of religion for all the people living inside the boundary. Could some areas be too small to study this connection? What about a single neighborhood? Could you measure these two things, pluralism and involvement, on the block where you live? And would that mean anything? What about for the zip code where you live? What about for your entire city or the whole county or maybe even the whole state? Could some areas be too big to measure these things realistically? Chavez and Gorski note this discussion about the most appropriate scale for research, but they don't throw out any studies based on this distinction. They consider that evidence from different scales of study might all be relevant to the debate. So in the end, they come up with 26 different articles published over the course of the 1990s, all related to the debate started by that original 1988 article published by Fink and Stark. These articles evaluate religious pluralism in locations all over the United States and also in other countries. They refer to different historical periods and use varying levels of geographic scale. In all, these articles present evidence from 193 different examples of social settings where we can compare information about religious pluralism to the extent of religious attendance or involvement in those same settings. Chavez and Gorski assemble all of this information in one standardized comparative framework and try to sort out which side of the debate has managed to come up more often with more convincing evidence. Does greater religious pluralism tend to go along with lower levels or with higher levels of religious involvement for the general population? It is time to look at the punchline of their results and conclusions next. Before we can cut to the chase and have a look at the conclusions reached by Chavez and Gorski, there's one last methodological issue we need to consider because it has played a prominent role in the ongoing debate over how religious pluralism or competition affects the level of religious involvement in a society. This methodological detail shows up mainly in some of the studies that have found support for the free market argument that more competing religious groups stimulate religious activity in the whole population. A significant number of studies that reached this conclusion included a special argument about taking account of the Roman Catholic Church as a special case among other religious denominations. Since Catholicism has been the unquestioned universal church for much of Europe historically, in those countries and in the United States and other former colonies dominated by European settlement, these scholars argued that the Catholic Church today is distinctively different from other denominations, and this must be considered when constructing analytic models. In the original supply-side free market article on religious competition, Fink and Stark found in 1988 that when they just compared religious life in different U.S. cities at the start of the 20th century, they actually found a negative link between more different denominational groups in a city and the overall level of church attendance in that city. This sounds like support for the older plausibility argument that inconsistencies between the teachings of different groups could lead people to question the whole religious enterprise. If these groups can't agree on religion, which one is right? Or maybe none of them are right and we should forget the whole thing? Obviously, Fink and Stark do not want to go there because they believed in a positive rather than a negative effect of competition on religious activity. So they argued that there's actually a lot of diversity within the Catholic Church. Catholics from Mexico, from Ireland, from Italy, some rich, some poor, in a way that you don't find in most of the Protestant denominations that tend to be, as we'll see in a later topic, more sorted out by social class and also by ethnic origins. So if there are a lot of Catholics in a city, the city may look like it has less religious pluralism, but the diversity among Catholics means that there's a lot of pluralism after all. This is an interesting argument, but their way of taking this into account raised a lot of immediate objections. They suggested that in addition to including the value of your pluralism index as a predictor of church attendance, you also need to put in a separate measure of the percentage of people who are Roman Catholics. They added this separate measure to their statistical equations, and lo and behold, when they did this, the negative link between the pluralism index and church attendance switched around and became a positive link. Fink and Stark claimed that this model was more complete and that it showed the real connection that they had predicted from free market economic theory. Many other critics, however, have rejected this claim. The trouble is that their additional measure of percentage Catholic in a city appears twice in the same model. It is also one of the percentages that are squared and added up to give the Pluralism Index. As the percent Catholic gets bigger, the percentages in other groups must get smaller, and the Pluralism Index therefore automatically will be lower. The Pluralism Index and percent Catholic always must be negatively related. This is a mathematical tautology and has nothing to do with ethnic diversity in the Catholic Church. The two predictors are not independent of each other, which violates fundamental assumptions needed for the results of such models to be interpreted in a sensible way. We know that across European countries, church attendance is higher in Catholic than in non-Catholic countries. The same was true for US cities at the start of the 20th century. That positive link, combined with the automatic negative link between percent Catholic and pluralism scores, means that whatever is left of the pluralism link after you take out the Catholic part will always be positively related to church attendance. The percent Catholic measure is now understood as a red herring on this question, and Chaves and Gorski therefore toss out any conclusions based on a model that includes this red herring in the measurement process. From the total of 193 different settings for which they found information in various published articles, Chaves and Gorski found 60 examples that claimed to find a positive link between more religious pluralism and higher church attendance. Unfortunately, over half of these settings only included one religious denomination or group, so they had to toss out these 37 studies because they did not actually measure anything that we could reliably call religious pluralism. Even in those irrelevant single group settings, 3 cases had positive results only for part of the studied group. Of the remaining 23 settings that yielded a positive effect of pluralism on church attendance, 12 used statistical models that included the bogus added variable for percentage of Catholics, which meant that the leftover effect of pluralism had to be positive as a mathematical tautology. So only 11 settings survive in which more religious pluralism was linked to more church attendance in some particular place at some particular point in history. By comparison, the other 133 settings generally found a negative link between religious pluralism and church attendance, just as Berger had concluded more than half a century ago that we should find. It is true that 40 of these settings also involved study of only one particular religious group or denomination in a place. So again, these examples had to be thrown out because they don't really include a valid measure of religious pluralism. But the remaining 93 studies support the original expectation that more religious pluralism will tend to appear along with less church attendance. Chavez and Gorski conclude their article with additional information from historical research and with some complaints that maybe we need to be thinking about this whole question in broader terms, such as looking at other aspects of religiosity besides just church attendance, and other aspects of competition than just numbers and sizes of different denominational groups. But at least their review article summed up some pretty solid evidence from a dozen years of research suggesting that the free market supply-side idea of competition promoting religious involvement can never turn into some kind of universal law of religion. If it is true in some times and places, we might ask ourselves what is special about those times and places when it does happen.